Hello, Fergus.
Hello, how are you?
Worried about the Church of England.
A reasonable position to hold, I think, at the moment.
Here we are. It's Advent, time when we're asked to think about the coming of the Lord, the incarnation, and also the second coming of the Lord, the end of time. And it's fair to say that the Church of England is in a terrible mess. Not so far from here, Archbishop Justin Welby has got the Packers in and getting ready to leave Lambeth Palace, having been forced, I think it's fair to say, been forced to resign. The Bishop of London, meanwhile, aware perhaps of the great spiritual needs of the people of her diocese at this time of acute crisis, has declared as her contribution the fact that she really misses the old-style Christmases when families used to gather around the television set and watch the TV together, Morecambe and Wise Christmas specials and all of that. So that's what Bishop Sarah has been getting
offered at the moment.
Recently. Yes. Education of a high order. Now, we could go in many directions when considering this big question of Church of England, Christianity, sex, the body, and we may come back to Justin and all of that. The malfeasances of Justin Welby, perhaps like a title of a rather saucy novel, at a later stage. But I thought it would be perhaps interesting to start off with anyway by thinking about how the Church of England itself has got itself into a state here. And it's partly an administrative question, of course, how that church understands itself. But reaching back into the history of Christianity does seem to me that it's about sex and Christianity and how it views the body, the human body. Now, the ghastly Smythe, clearly a case, I think, of a man trying to control his homosexual urges and thwacking young boys as a result in order to, as it were, flagellate and mortify his own flesh through theirs. But Christianity has always found the body something of a problem, it seems to me.
It has, which when you consider the incarnation being the central sort of initiating theological tenet of Christianity.
Well, Christianity is a very fleshly religion.
It is a very fleshly religion. There's sort of an irony that it has such a strange relationship with the body. Now, some of that, there's different schools of thought on it. There's the idea that in fact, Christ himself in his ministry says almost nothing in the Gospels about bodies. He's actually quite reticent to talk about the body. He talks a lot more about the spirit. He talks a lot more about aspects of societal, structures. He talks very rarely about the individuals and bodies. There's the woman caught in adultery. It's there, but at a distance. That's more about how do the religious authorities enforce sort of social mores than about the specific nitty-gritty of sex itself.
Christianity is quite keen to get away from the nitty-gritty of sex when talking about the body, which is why the body is such a powerful metaphor in the history of Christianity.
Well, and then yet the body is at the very centre because it is the body of Christ is at the centre of the gospel narratives from the birth, the incarnation, the birth, through to the very graphic description of the death of Christ on the cross. The fact that we know his side is pierced, we know that his hands are nailed, etc., etc. The really quite unpleasant bodily realities of crucifixion are there, and then you have doubting Thomas. There's a very infleshed aspect to it. Now there are those who sort of then. The logic being, Christ didn't, say much, so it's St. Paul who does all this. I think that's possibly unfair. We have to really go back a step and consider how Judaism viewed the body. Now, you don't have to have read Portnoy's complaint to know that, Judaism and the body is an exceptionally complex series of religious commands, of anxieties, of a whole culture in and of itself. And I think it's sometimes important. Christians sort of sometimes forget that what Paul is doing is he's largely speaking to communities of Jews for whom what they did with their bodies in all kinds, whether that related to food or sex or washing or anything, was hugely important. So what Paul, I think, is doing, it's often forgotten, is sort of trying to put the Christian theology behind some of the kind of anxieties and angsts and practices that would have been going on anyway. And that's why we end up with this slightly strange, because Paul is trying to, very strongly put across the idea that the spirit is stronger than the body.
Yes.
And yet he's dealing with this quite angsty group of people for whom bodily functions are an obsession.
Absolutely. And a less angsty relationship to the body for the Greco-Roman culture in which Christianity is born and evolves. Lots of games.
Absolutely.
Prowess.
Absolutely. And like so many things, I think Christianity's position does come to a certain extent from the clash of the attempt to kind of fuse these two almost antithetical kind of views to things. It's interesting if you read in the book of the Maccabean Revolt, the 4 books of the Maccabees. One of the things that sort of a constant is about how this Hellenistic culture is infiltrating the youth of Judea, the young Jews. Yes. There's this talk about how they go and they exercise, they try and reverse their circumcisions, things like that. So it's sort of at the front line. There
are some appalling passages about trying to reverse circumcision.
Absolutely, and it becomes this sort of front line.
Trying to pin it back on.
Absolutely, and one sort of balks at what the technicalities might be in terms of that. But there is certainly this sort of idea that the body is in the front line of identity for both Greeks and Jews in the world.
And Paul himself uses lots of metaphors from athletic games, doesn't he?
Constantly, as well as constantly using the metaphor of circumcision. So the body. It's not that, and we have to consider that even in Jewish ritual washing, things like nudity would have been much more present in the lives of people in the first century Mediterranean than it is now. Actually, we have a sort of almost, it's unfair to say Victorian even.
Yes, well, mind you, we don't have the climate for that.
That's very true. That's very true. But both Jews and Greeks alike would have been very used to seeing one another naked. The body would have been more sort of obviously in the face of religious practice than it is now.
And the centrality of incarnation, centrality of the body, God incarnated in flesh, is what is such a scandal to the Hebrews and indeed a folly to the Greeks.
And indeed, it's at the absolute centre of all of Nicaea, Chalcedon, all of those fights the church is having over the next several hundred years of the early church, those councils, those synods, trying to hammer out what the Christian faith means. Invariably, it goes back to that. The concept of as we approach Christmas, I can't help but think of "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." There's that controversial line, "Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see."
Yes.
People said, "Is this a form of heresy? Is this saying that Jesus is only veiled in flesh, as opposed to fully taking on human flesh?"
That's the medieval Spanish heresy known as adoptionism, isn't it?
Indeed, and it features in Marcionism.
That God appears and he, as it were, adopts this.
And there's Arianism. All of those heresies essentially all come down to trying to hammer out what is this relationship between God and man in flesh.
Well, hammering out the sex business, if I can be allowed to use that rather awkward phrase, takes many, many centuries. And is an ongoing process.
And
it's centuries before clerical celibacy becomes a thing to go to.
Absolutely.
It's what, 11th, 12th century?
Well, and indeed, the Eastern Church would say, well, that was never actually, that's in many ways, clerical celibacy is a political fact for the Western Church to deal with. It's partly, it's those reforms of the popes as they begin to try and accrue a degree of power, and
it's about the church being an independent powerhouse.
Correct, and it's to do with things like property. As much as anything else, you can't have the awkward, fact of heirs of the body coming and saying
that's the beginning of the long history in the West of church versus state.
Absolutely.
And sometimes church being equated with state.
Absolutely. Whereas, of course, in the East, you don't have that, but you do have this kind of a much more rigorous monastic tradition. You have the tradition that comes out of Egypt, Antony of Egypt. You have St. John Cassian, who is, who writes an awful lot of this stuff. A lot of our thinking in both East and West.
The monk in the desert.
Absolutely. Cassian, Cassian's interesting because it's thought that Cassian actually is probably a Westerner initially. He's probably born in the West. We don't quite know. But he certainly is very strongly influenced by the tradition of Antony of Egypt and the tradition of essentially the hermits in the East, who are, asceticism to levels that we can't even begin to think of.
Yes, and sitting on top of pillars.
Stalactites, exactly, that sort of thing. Starving themselves, eating with dogs.
Not much of a possibility of procreating and starting the Christian family.
I mean,
if you're living on top of a pillar.
Absolutely. And actually, these people have much more in common with a Greek philosopher like Diogenes than they really do with sort of other contemporary Christian thinkers. But it's Cassian then goes back to Constantinople, and he sees the city that's around him. A city where there's a sort of a scandal in Byzantine court circles because noblemen are very often ending up having sex with their own illegitimate children, male and female, because of the circles of prostitutes and the use. The use of child prostitutes is considered the norm. Rape is considered the norm. The abandonment of babies is considered the norm. Cassian sees the sexual kind of mores of the early Byzantine, late kind of Roman Empire, and he says, actually, we've got to model something very different.
What does seem to be the case when people looked at these early Christian communities, talking about first, second, third centuries now, is that they were strikingly chaste.
Yes.
That they were very, very different from the Greco-Roman world that surrounded them, and that there was a reticence about the body and about displays of flesh and setting displays of nakedness. But there was a kind of meekness about them that did strike the Greco-Roman world as strange.
And it's part, sex is just one, and the body are just one of many ways that they try. Money is another one. How they deal with goods and things.
Yeah.
The Christians are at constant pains to differentiate themselves. Now, there's debates about this. Now, that's partly because it's what they are told to do in the Gospels and in Paul. It's partly due to the idea of an apocalyptic. To what extent is early Christianity an apocalyptic cult that's expecting the end of the world? No need to, have loads of sex and spend loads of money if you think it's all going to be over in 5 minutes. But so certainly but it comes to be part of a very built-in sense of differentiation from the rest of the world. Now, what ends up happening, of course, is the rest of the world sort of collapses. You have the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. You have the collapse of all of those ways that the societal structures that had previously governed sex and the body, the societal norms. And so suddenly the people who are left and seem to be left with integrity are the Christians.
Now, family as a way of controlling, canalizing the sexual urge, better to do that than to burn in hell, as I think it's in Paul's.
Yes. Better to. Yeah.
I mean, this emerges in a very kind of turbocharged way, I think, in the 16th century. You're going to read the letters of Martin Luther to his wife, Katja, who had, of course, been a nun, to realize how very exciting Martin Luther found sex, but also the whole model of the minister, the pastor with his family.
Absolutely.
In the manse and in the vicarage. This is a new thing in Christian history.
Absolutely.
And very important for all the Christian churches in
and
Britain and
transformative of almost every sphere of modern life, really, particularly looking at things like literature or the idea of a literate household.
Yes,
is complete, and there's no coincidence that you look at the great writers in the Low Countries, in Scandinavia, and especially in England. They all of them generally are children of or themselves clergy.
Yes.
And that's no coincidence.
A very important social grouping.
It is.
Sons and daughters of the clergy.
Sons and daughters of the clergy. And it does transform Western culture in a number of ways, and education and literature. But you're right, it comes from...
And up until then, the parochial clergy, that wasn't where the action was, intellectually speaking, in the Western Church in the Middle Ages. I mean, they were far less educated than their successors in the Christian ministry in the 16th century.
Absolutely.
Many were indeed completely illiterate.
Absolutely.
Barely able to kind of read out the Mass. And real intellectual life cultural life in the Middle Ages, in the West certainly, is in the monasteries, is in the religious orders.
Which takes us back to that thing of, the idea of sex as dangerous distraction
Yes.
that emerges in the medieval West. This idea that, okay, well, if sex happens, then not only do you have all the problem of looking after a family, you've then got the problem that they might want some share in your property.
Yes.
And then you've got the problem that you can't be pursuing the intellectual life and the interior life of the spirit that you have been called to do.
Now, there's something rather cloying about the whole idea of the Christian family as it develops in the 19th, possibly in the 20th century, actually, as well. And a large number of people seem to have forgotten that there had been families for quite a long period of time before Christianity.
Yes.
So equating Christianity with the familiar life was a big historical mistake. But the idea of the family unit, not necessarily a conservative idea at all.
No.
If you look at the history of his relationship to the state, indeed, it could be seen to be a very radical thing,
Subversive,
doing something different from what the state wants you to do.
Absolutely,
or leading a more private life. I wanted us to move on now to think about the relationship between church and state and how this is actually reflected in the problems that Justin Welby has arguably placed himself. Church versus state. Church against the arrogant secularity of the state. Is a very big thing as it emerges, especially in France at the end of the 19th and 20th century. Long history, of course, of French secularity. But that the church needs to be free in order to sort out its own affairs, which is a theme we've heard in rather decadent form of late. But it starts as a marvellous idea, I think. Libera Chiesa and Libera Stato, free church in a free state, and the church able to organize itself as a corporation, as it were, an autonomous institute. It does seem to me that this is one of the features of the contemporary Church of England problem, that we're no longer talking about that distinguished tradition, autonomous institute, giving freedom to individuals, freedom to stand up against an arrogant and sometimes violent secularity. In contemporary terms, we seem now to be talking about the church as a way of opting out from proper standards in public life.
Yes,
and this is where the handling of the spy stuff really comes.
Yes, I think there's two aspects there. There is the sort of the historic weight of the relationship between church and state, and Justin Welby was on record of saying, I think I'm running one of the great departments of state. He viewed himself as, the equivalent of the secretary at the Home Office or the FCO or the Treasury, or Number 10. So there's that sort of particular, slightly invidious sort of Whig Erastianism that's sort of always been there.
Yes.
But I think there's then the added problem that, of course, both church and state and every other institution is now hidebound by a kind of completely unaccountable managerialism and a kind of school of consultancy and all this slightly mysterious.
And all this rather strange idea that, this joint has been badly run up until now. And what we need is one of these super managers to come in and sort itself out. And these managerial consultancies will be able to sort out the Church of England. And in fact, the last thing that they're capable of doing is running anything, really.
Therein lies the problem. And there is then the theological issue, which goes back to what we were talking about the body. Actually, there is a calling for the church to be different, to differentiate itself from the ways of the world, and to say, well, the rest of the world is going down this managerial path. It's going down this idea that you can sort of consult your way out of problems. We know that, like every other trend and fad, will pass. How can the church model something different? How can the church look to the eternal? How can the church look to the divine? How can the church say, well, actually, our structures are not our own to fiddle with in this way? And I think that was the fundamental underlying arrogance of Justin Welby, and that deep down he believed that his way was better than any kind of thing that had existed for thousands of years before.
Yes.
And it was his mission to make the church in his own image.
Well, it's the executive style in action, isn't it? I mean, it's the bishop as the permanent secretary.
And a CEO and all that. There was that insane idea that bishops all needed to have MBAs. Ironically, just at the time when the City of London is increasingly aware of the idea of spiritual needs and the needs of mental health and things like that, you are more likely to be sent on a sort of Ignatian spirituality retreat by Citibank than you are by the diocese, who are going to try and send you on a kind of managerial course. So we have this insane topsy-turvydom. But Welby was absolutely symbolic of that, and I think that is related to his handling of a lot of these scandals.
Well, I was terribly revealing in his resignation or farewell statement, his speech in the House of Lords, when he was explaining why he felt that he had to go. And regardless, he said, of almost, he seems to be implying that he was not personally responsible for anything that had gone badly wrong, although the Macon report did make it painfully clear to everybody that he had done an awful lot of things that were administratively wrong and false and lying in the state. But regardless, as I said, there comes a stage when bad things have happened in an organisation. You're the head of the organisation, you seem to be saying. You're in what people call, I think, sometimes a leadership role. He's in a leadership role. And because he's in a leadership role, he's got to bear this terrible burden and to lay down his life for the sake of the institution, as it were. Now, this seems to be so strange for any kind of Christian leader to talk of him or herself as the head of an institution.
Not only...
Justin is not the head of the Church of England. Christ is the head of the church.
And the king is the supreme governor. There's a whole layer of...
this came in during the Reformation.
Yes.
Politics. Now, King Henry VIII, being a nasty but not unintelligent brute, did actually arrogate himself for a number of years the title of head of the church, Caput Ecclesiae. But his son, being a more devout and learned Protestant, got rid of that, and he said, I will be supreme governor. Christ is the head of the church.
Which was then confirmed by his considerably more intelligent daughter, and which is the settlement which we have today. And so, yes, not only constitutional nonsense, but this is the thing, it sort of reveals not only an ignorance, but a kind of learnt ignorance, a deep sense of, I don't need to know those things. I don't care about those things.
Well, I think we can call it culpable ignorance.
Culpable ignorance.
Because there are some things that some people in some jobs ought to know about.
Absolutely.
And that's one of them. Someone
pointed out to me that one of the first things Justin Welby did under the previous regime, there was a whole chunk of, if you clicked on archbishopofcanterbury.com or whatever it is, .org, Lambeth Palace's website, there was obviously a very large drop-down menu which listed all of the previous 106 or whatever it was, Archbishop of Canterbury. Some of them, some of the Saxon ones, we have just a line or two on them, but there's some very important figures in frankly, global Christianity there. Dr. Cranmer, Lord, Temple in recent years. One of the first things Justin Welby did was remove that whole section of the website and replace it with a biography of himself, because the weight and the history of the institution did not matter to him. And he famously said in one of his interviews when he was trying to save his skin, "I don't give a hang about the institution." Well, you can't then be in a leadership role because what do you then think the institution is about? The only answer can be you.
Yes.
And that is a problem, particularly in a Christian context.
Well, there were a whole series of excruciatingly self-pitying conversations that he did with various other thought leaders on the radio, I think about a year or so ago, and in which they all shared the burden of being leaders and how awful it was and what a terribly hard work. Nobody really understood how ghastly it is to be a leader.
And this is why, again, I would say there's been quite a lot of narrative that says, this is a specific church problem. It does relate to the church and sex and the body. I actually increasingly am of the opinion that it isn't. I think this is our leadership caste problem. It is a problem of the particular group of people we have across the institutions for whom this is very much the narrative that, I'm doing this great thing. And I cannot tell you.
I'm doing this for you.
I'm doing this for you and I know best. Yeah. I cannot tell you the number of conversations I've had with people, senior legal figures, senior political figures, in the past couple of weeks saying, but Justin was he was a good man, really, one of us. The irony is, of course, these people don't think of themselves as part of the ruling class. They think that they're there to shake up, the world of port-stained earls in St. James. The world has not been run by port-stained earls, sadly, for a very, very long time. It's been run by these people, these managerial kind of, figures who are often very shadowy, often completely eschew any sense of oversight
and
or any sense of scrutiny.
Fully equipped with an MBA.
Well, precisely. But there is this real narrative that one of us, part of that group. And I think that's really been the problem, that there has been this infiltration at every single level. We saw it at the BBC, the complete failure to take any kind of...
and there's a related question. When the SHIT hits the fan, or in the case of the Church of England, when the SHIT hits the mitre repeatedly, they draw together.
Yes.
In their ranks.
Yes.
They refuse to actually engage with the issue. And then there's a cover-up.
And this is the problem, that there has been a real, in previous years, there was a real sense of diversity on the bishop's bench. There's that marvellous story about Winnington Ingram, who was the Bishop of London, meeting Mervyn Stockwood on the on Westminster Bridge. And Winnington Ingram was generally dressed in a pinstripe suit and a sort of bowler hat. And Stockwood arrived in full flowing robes, and Winnington Ingram just said, incognito, I see, Mervyn. But you had these characters who were manifestly opposed in their externals and in their kind of thought. Winnington Ingram was a great bastion of kind of the Tory establishment, and Stockwood was a socialist. But you had a diversity of thought. What we do not have now is that.
We don't have diversity of thought.
Not at all.
What you have is a common greyness.
Yes.
That just kind of sits over Lambeth, York, the two great provinces.
Absolutely.
And the inability to preach.
That is a problem.
I can remember the number of services I've been to when everything's going, extremely well. And then some idiot gets up in the pulpit and starts mouthing completely inane gibberish. Really.
Yes.
And if you don't have a gospel to preach, what's the point of it all?
Well, therein lies. The standard of leadership in the Church of England is now, I think. I think it would be very hard to point to a lower ebb. Interesting, if we go back to history, people talk about the medieval church, and you have people like Bishop Dispenser of Norwich massacring peasants. Clearly not a nice man, but very. The idea that at least there was some oomph about these people. You go to the 18th century now. There's huge historiographical revisionism actually now on the 18th century church, and actually most of those bishops, the idea that they were all kind of lazy, brandy swilling Erastians is clearly not true. I don't think you could look at any period of the church's history in England and say that you have a worse bench of bishops than they have now. No.
And a clerical body that seems to be incapacitated in its response to the great crisis of our time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And increasingly people look at the Church of England and say, well, it hasn't got any answers. Now, the said contra to that is that obviously there are plenty of places on the ground that are doing marvellous work, parish priests who are making enormous difference in their communities. And lest we forget, church attendance is actually rising. Now, that relates to the recovery post-COVID, but church attendance in this country is a very unappreciated statistic, is in fact increasing year on year. Now, it's still not back up to where it was before the pandemic, but there is no guarantee that it was going to return at all. And the fact that it is testament, I think, to the hard work of clergy on the ground.
But look at where all the church money goes in terms, not all of it, but a great deal of it, goes in terms of admin jobs. And if one is among that very select body who peruse the pages of the Church Times from time to time and looks at appointments and vacancies, directors of mission, left, right, and centre,
diocesan secretaries,
secretaries,
directors of discipleship and things like that.
Yes.
I mean, the Diocese of Truro famously had more people in managerial positions than it did stipendiary priests as of last year. Yeah. Although again,
but this is what institutions in crisis so often do.
They do.
They take refuge in sometimes actually in the new director's boardroom.
Absolutely.
Whereas lots of companies facing bankruptcies, they go for a very expensive refit.
It feels like the end of any sort of empire, the end of Byzantium when everything is so complicated.
Yes.
The end of the Venetian Republic, the end of the Soviet Union. Yes. You have this.
Let's establish a new Department of State.
Precisely, that's what we'll do. But of course, actually, in many ways, to go back to where we started on church and state, the church is simply mirroring what the state is doing.
Yes.
This is identical to what's happening in Whitehall. And that therein lies, actually, there's still church and state for all of their kind of tensions at the moment, and all the idea of Harriet Harman is going to be the person who finally gets rid of bishops in the House of Lords, which I think is clearly nonsense. They are in this sort of dance, it's a bit like in Roth's novel, the Radetzky March, when they hear of the death of Franz Josef and they continue this sort of deathly dance around the ballroom. Church and state at the moment are still stuck in this sort of increasingly slow two-step with one another, where they mirror each other's failings and increasingly don't fail to mirror one another's successes.
And this marvellously wicked ability of the modern state to proclaim the need to take action right here and now.
Yes.
But the form that the action takes is actually to employ more people. As with the new Department of Paperclips, as I like to think of it as being, because they've just discovered that an awful lot of money has been wasted on new folders for ministers.
Yes.
So now there's a new task force going to be established in order to deal with this.
Set up a committee. But the Church of England does this as well. It said, we've got decreasing disciples. Well, let's set up a new discipleship groups. Rather than saying, well, can we resource the things on the ground? We must do something new. And there's a narrative that's very invidious, particularly in the Church of England, that the people who oppose that attitude don't want growth. They say, well, you don't want the Church of England, you just want it to decline. That's not true. It's saying that actually I fundamentally disagree with your analysis that, well, the way we do that is by doing new things. Actually, what we do is say, well, what do we do well and how do we do it better?
Something we haven't discussed so far, evangelicals. Mm-hmm. The evangelical party within the Church of England.
Yes.
Patchy history. More recently, very involved in the sex stuff, very opposed to a more charitable and latitudinarian attitude towards gay marriages and blessings. But the evangelicals in the Church of England are the people who got the money.
Yes.
Because you've got to take one's hat off to them. They do tithes.
Absolutely. And very often they can run churches without much reference to the Central Church of England, because fundamentally they aren't running small churches in rural Norfolk. They're generally not running churches in deprived areas of Lancashire. What they're generally doing is picking their battles, which of course was Smythe's whole thing. That very invidious idea that you seize the leadership of the nation by going to the main public schools and getting the best men. Yes. And of course, Welby and this is again a very unappreciated aspect of the scandal, is that Welby is the first, and I sincerely hope the last, of that experiment. He was the ultimate in that experiment. Yes. He went on these camps. He was groomed from an early age for leadership, and he got there.
Well, being groomed for leadership is exactly right. Isn't it? Taking people very early on and training them and infiltrating the organisation.
Absolutely.
Trotskyite, really.
Yes, Jesuitical, one might even say.
Even as well. Do you think evangelicals have got a particular problem about sex?
Yes.
Because Smythe, deeply evangelical.
Yes.
And Justin Welby emerges from that evangelical tradition. Largely, it seems to me, put in place in Canterbury by an evangelical cabal.
Yes.
Some of whom are now ruining the consequences.
Well, yes, and it's very interesting that part of the reason why Welby had to go is because the evangelicals did turn against him. But one of the reasons why they turned against him is because they thought he was softening on the sex stuff by being more open to the idea that there might be blessings. So suddenly conservative evangelicals who had said, well, he's our man in Havana. He's, the one he's running things for us there. Suddenly thought, oh, hang on. We put him in place specifically to do this thing, i.e. stop any expansion on sex, which we thought, those dangerous Catholics and liberals would dilute. And he's then gone native, and that's what they couldn't abide. Yes. But yes, I think there is a particular obsession with sex in the evangelical party, which is interesting because for a long time there was a narrative.
Sort of apparently clean living.
Well, this is the thing. The narrative was always
often very athletic.
Yes, it was the high church party that had a problem with sex because they all dressed up in lace and they all were far too close to their mothers and they, prayed to Mary, and this is all a bit suspect and effete and effeminate. And you see that from the very earliest days when the Society of the Holy Cross, the Societae Sanctissimi Crucis, is founded. immediately people say, well, it's the Society of Sodomite Clergy. That's a Victorian, the Victorians come up with that Victorian trope. So the idea of the high church party as sexually ambiguous, as effeminate, and as not, someone who you could quite trust, alone with a young man or something, is a very well established trope. But the irony, of course, is that evangelicalism had many, many of those problems as well. They were simply suppressing them. Precisely. And therefore you get this actually exceptionally toxic environment where it then theologically expresses itself through physical violence, through a manipulation of scripture. So yes, I think it's something that people don't want to talk about in the church, because fundamentally it involves having a discussion with quite a sizable and, as you say, wealthy and influential chunk of the Church of England, saying there's something fishy in your theology. In the theology, in the root things that you, and, liberal open evangelicals say, oh, it's not fair, it's not, don't blame us. But there is something invidious about the way your hermeneutics, the way you are saying, well, how are you justifying your beliefs and your actions? And if it's constantly in reference to simply quoting a certain bit of scripture, well, that's not
selectively chosen.
Well,
As always.
And who does that best? Well, the devil does that constantly with Christ. We see him constantly do that throughout Scripture. So there is actually a thorny theological discussion to have there.
Which is why it seems to evangelicals find the whole idea of Catholic tradition very difficult to deal with and deeply opposed to it. The whole idea of the apostolic ministry, the idea of the spiritual theological justification for episcopacy itself. Yes. The evangelicals don't really understand what a bishop is for.
No.
Really.
No, well, which is why
he's a manager for the evangelicals.
Or a senior pastor, a leader, a manager, exactly.
Thought leader. Yes.
Exactly, a thought leader. And therefore, they are very happy for them to mirror the ways of the world, because there isn't any metaphysical understanding of the bishop as set aside. There isn't really any understanding of orders as set aside. Ironically, of course, there's Catholic clericalism and there's terrible examples of it. But actually, you create a much more toxic clericalist culture if you have shed yourself of all of the structures of the church. The reason why those things are there is partly to keep the individual clergy in line, say, well, actually, you're not here as you.
And very authoritarian.
Indeed. Actually very authoritarian.
I mean, the emergence of the archdeacon as the bishop's knock.
Enforcer
is a really sinister and terrible feature of contemporary Anglicans.
And you have this aspect of yes, it then becomes about the individual's charism, and it becomes about the individual's power over people, the individual's ability to raise money, etc. And that's where someone like Smythe can flourish, because of course he clearly was a very charismatic man. He clearly was a man who could persuade people, as these manipulators often are, clearly profoundly narcissistic. And so you are providing essentially an open goal for someone who is
and as a
an abuser.
And as a barrister, clearly very good at persuading jury for a client such as Mrs. Whitehouse.
Indeed, for whom he worked.
When he acted.
Absolutely. So there is this sort of, I absolutely agree that there is a very difficult theological conversation that people are not quite, I suspect, not ready to have, or don't want to have.
Or wouldn't be capable of having.
Or indeed, therein lies.
Just not knowing enough.
Back to where we talked about at the very start. Who among the bishops could create a coherent, argument against that kind of cultural stuff? There isn't. I don't think there is one.
Well, clearly, it's a terrible mess.
It is.
But at least we've been able to locate the dimension of the mess.
Yes.
And go through the rest of Advent and see what next happens along the Lambeth Way.
Absolutely.
Fergus, thank you very much indeed for coming along and talking to me today. And have a happy and holy feast when it arrives.
You too. It's lovely to speak to you.